Last time I talked about the evolution of large-scale experimentation and the problem of maintaining enough of a voice for the collaboration as a whole. On the one side, pushing towards being able to speak univocally and having the authority of the collaboration behind a view, and the concomitant problem of that requiring a consensus where in fact there might be dissensus within the group. So you have this difficulty of how to come to a conclusion in a collaboration that evolved, as I discussed last time, from 10 to 15 in the 1960s to bubble chamber groups to 2,500 or 3,000 with the Large Hadron Collider. And so these problems of credit and authorship, which seem extrinsic to, seem like pure sociology in a sense, in fact make a difference to what can be claimed by the collaboration, and indeed whether the collaboration can make claims at all. And that led to a comparative look among the different kinds of collaborations about what the mechanisms are for coming to agreement. And we discussed some of those, of having publication committees or internal and external refereeing and many other structures. What I want to do today is to drill down further into the epistemology of the collaboration and to look at the different forms of collaboration that can take place as a kind of a foil against which I want to position the kind of work that goes on briefly that I'll characterize from the Large Hadron Collider, and then in more depth on the Event Horizon Telescope. There's Galaxy Zoo, which is an amateur affiliation of people interested in astronomy, of citizen scientists, but there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. And there are now many papers that have a large number of citations that credit the Galaxy Zoo, around 100,000 people, for analyzing and sorting out galaxies into their morphological types. So let me just give you an idea of that. This is a contrast set, it's not the main topic. But I need to be able to go down, oops. Okay, so the Galaxy Zoo is citizens classifying galaxies into spiral and other forms of galaxies. And I don't know why I can't, okay. So you have massive numbers of images of galaxies that have been provided by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey and by the Hubble Space Telescope, many more than can be characterized by a small group or even a large group of astronomers. And so you might say, well, can't it be automated? Well, it turns out not to be automated very well, and the pattern recognition programs don't work particularly efficaciously. So that led to the astronomers enlisting citizen scientists. And so people will come sign up and they'll take a course online and they have to pass tests, whether it's smooth or have features or a disk, whether it's and to dismiss it from artifacts or stars. And they have questions, is it completely round? Is it cigar shaped? Is it in between? And then you get a trial run and you have to sort things. And if you succeed, you can become a member of the Galaxy Zoo. And then you're involved in this amateur professional collaboration. What's interesting to me is that then there are people that people get very excited about this. They'll talk with each other, they form groups. I'm a former galaxy spotter from your earlier exercises, just love the new Hubble data. These kind of pictures make me feel good in my belly. I really have the feeling that I belong out there. Nice work, guys. Glad to know that we played some small part in your project. And so there are these results that have come out. There's subgroups that form. Some of them, as you can see, have 112,000 people in them. And they began to publish. This is one that has a sample of 37,000 spiral galaxies from the Sloan Digital Survey. And they tried to decide whether there were as many right-hand spirals as left-hand spirals and look for isotropy and statistical characterization of how isotropic it was. Another one, Morphologies derived from visual inspection of galaxies. This had 100,000 volunteers from the Galaxy Zoo project, and it's gotten hundreds of citations in the literature. So it's gotten to be a big thing. What I wanted to point out is that basically all of these people are doing the same thing. They're multiplied. It's like an aggregate of the same work repeated over and over again. And I want to contrast that with other forms of collaboration, like colliding beam detectors in particle physics, where you have, sort of axisymmetric detector, $1 billion each if they're at the Large Hadron Collider, and there's a muon detector and calorimeters and all these different things. And the different groups that build these form the sort of epistemic authorities on how they function. And so an argument that's made needs, in some sense, the collaborative argumentation by these different groups that are organized around, here color-coded, different parts of the detector. So it's a different form of a collaboration. This is not an aggregation of people all doing the same thing. It's a collaboration among people doing very different things and having very different kinds of expertise on liquid scintillators or on central tracking devices or on muon detectors. And the way people come to agree that they've actually shown something depends on the coordination of these different component parts. This is an example. I mean, one way to probe what actually is important to people is to look at what happens when things go wrong. So they failed to make a good path for the cables that had to come out from the inner part of this complicated tracking device. And so the path had to be cut over different subdetector territories. And that led to a big battle among all the universities and collaborations of universities over whose ox would be gored, whose detector would be gored by these different paths. But you can see that, in fact, there is a real territoriality to this. There's responsibility, there's big finances involved in a large detector. You can have many different large companies involved in producing these things, universities, independent laboratories. And because one is responsible for the detector, not only in building it, but testing it, and then in maintaining it and asserting what can actually be claimed on the basis of these different subdetectors, the path became very crucial. Or another example, this was a time when the mechanical engineers, the cryogenic engineers, and the electronic engineers were not talking to each other sufficiently. This is one of the things I've been very interested in, is how trading zones, or places where different expertise come into contact. And because the cryogenic engineers were not talking to the electrical engineers, the heat generated was not being brought out of this electronics. The risk was that these hugely expensive component parts would melt down. And so they had to come in, and the mechanical engineers had to design these kludge-like insertions of pipes to bring in cooled liquid to make it function. Here's a software analog of that in a different experiment, where you can see that the different parts, each of these different abbreviations, extrapolation, distortion, haywire, were all connected to one another. The vertex software here, where the colliding beams hit, are all connected. But what you see is that there's this line here of part of these two detectors that had been forced to work together weren't talking to each other. So there was this went from the beginning of the data down to the final tape. At the time they were using tape, the digital tape that came out of this. And you could see, just looking at the flowchart of the software, that these two parts of the experiment, PEP9 and the rest of it, were not talking to one another. And that lack of talking to one another was catastrophic for this particular experiment, and led eventually to enormous cost overruns and difficulties in the physics they wanted to do. So coordination in the collaboration is crucial. and how you take these different expertise, whether it's mechanical, electrical, cryogenic, or whether it's software coordination or theoretical coordination, was crucial in making these experiments work. Okay, now I want to turn to the Event Horizon Telescope using my vastly oversimplified characterization of LHC and the galaxy zoo aggregation forms as background to make a contrast with what had to happen in the Event Horizon Telescope, both in the work and the papers that reflected them on M87. So this was the suite of papers which corresponded to a sequential flow of the project. There's an introductory essay, put that aside. The instrument had to be built and coordinated through the array of 8 telescopes on 6 sites. The data processing and calibration, often underestimated, hugely important, had to take that and coordinate all of these different results from the different parts of the array and calibrate them to make sure that the results would be meaningful. There is the imaging of the central supermassive black hole, which is what I want to focus on in my remaining 18 to 20 minutes. And then the physical origin, which was basically modeling, and then finally the shadow and mass of the central black hole, extracting parameters from that work in the theory part of the collaboration. So this was a flow. In some sense, each part depended on the work of the previous parts as one went from 2 through 6. So there is coordination within each of these work groups and papers, and then there's coordination of a sequential form down from as the numbers rise. So quoting from Esch, in one of his papers, he said, if we obtain very different restorations of the image, the places where they agree should tell us what we can really believe. And that's a kind of a theme that repeats itself within the EHT over and over again. There are different kinds of ways of representing, of making the instrument work. In a sense, the instrument is as much software as it is hardware. The instrument of the Event Horizon Telescope and how to recover images from the data is as difficult as getting the data in the first place. And then it only functions because the Earth is turning. So the instrument is actually the Earth plus the telescopes, their coordination, and the software that's used to address them. Without all of those things, without the Earth turning, without the array and its coordination, and without a form of image reduction, there is no instrument. It's just a bunch of expensive equipment. So there were different forms of taking the data, which is sparse and noisy, and trying to get some images out of it. One of them, the tried and true clean technique, had been used in astronomy for a long time and had been developed in part to capture stars, point sources of light out of in blurry situations. Another, the regularized maximum likelihood methods, tended to use prior views about what one should be seeing, and then worked forward towards making an image based on this sparse and noisy data. So the kind of agonistic structures, the oppositions that were used to convince people in the Narayan-esque way that they were looking at something real were, for instance, hackathons, where the group, where we took the different forms of image reproduction and distributed blurred out versions of different astronomical objects, images taken at random off the internet, sometimes just as bizarre as Frosty the Snowman, so that there wouldn't be any expectations of what people were supposed to get in order to see if four distinct groups using different image reduction techniques could produce something. So there were simulations of black holes. There were astronomical images of other sorts. There were natural images like the one on the right. You can see this image, someone making a movie, which is appropriate enough, and to see what the different groups would get. So here you have clean, here's the target image, and then these various, there's a form of imaging, very interesting, that ended up not being part of the final paper, but called CHIRP, and to see what they would get under these different circumstances. So these different sort of what I'm calling agonistic robustness, that is to say, arguments of contrast, were very important in achieving any kind of consensus, first in the image group, and then in the collaboration more widely. You tried these different reconstruction techniques. You saw if you got something in common and tested against a test image. And then you tried contrasting models and images. You tried contrasting simulations, data, and models. There's constantly coming back to this question of, was something robust in these different domains with different kinds of models, different kinds of general relativistic magnetohydrodynamic simulations, and constantly varying things to make new kinds of tests to see if the methods could be counted upon. So here's Daniel Palumbo putting up frosted paper in this room that we're in, so that other groups couldn't see what they were doing in order to maintain this idea of independence of the different, of 4 different groups that were established using different techniques to see if they got the same result. There's a scene also just around the corner. I won't play it for you. It's in the movie. I've shown it to you a million times. I apologize. But it's, what would happen when different people tried to image the actual data on the 5th of June, 2018. Close the door. Then so this was a form of expert judgment, of saying to people in various groups, what would you get if you use your best ideas about how to produce an image using clean or one of these Bayesian methods, and to see first, could they come up with an image, and then were the images derived independently from one another in accord? And it looked like they were pretty similar. So in the 24th of July, the groups got together downstairs in this building and began to see that, in fact, their images matched to a large degree, although there are lots of ways in which they differed. They were all getting a ring of approximately the same size with an asymmetry in azimuth. So then the question is, again, it was constantly a set of tests. And I think that one of the differences with high energy physics is this wasn't a question of just determining, say, the mass of a new particle or whether a new particle existed. Are there antiprotons? Does the Higgs exist? If the Higgs exists, what mass does it have? With an image, there are a huge number of ways they can disagree or they can agree. And so the constant worry was that we were trying to get an image and we were getting what we expected to get. So it could be that all the 4 groups all wanted to see a ring and found rings in their different ways. Is there a way to mechanize or make more algorithmic the parameter search and let the computer try out all sorts of different settings of the different ways we could set the camera, so to speak, and try it out on rings and crescents and disks and 2 blobs and see what the results might be, and then to find a metric that would rank them or give us the best choices that led the computer to identify the best reproduction of these different elements or several of them aggregatively. And so that was in some sense, a second stage of the drive to consensus. How could you dial in these different parameters, total flux, the variations, the smooth edges, the sharp edges, and these different parameters, there were 7 or 8 of them, could be varied in millions of different ways. And this kind of mechanical form of search then supplemented or complemented the expert judgment of the first stage. And so there were lots of setting these different, the different regularizers at 0 or 1 or 10 or 10 to the second, 10 to the third, and the computer would then look at various combinations to see which ones were best able to reproduce the test images. So then there came a point where, okay, so there are lots of images now, hundreds of thousands of images, and which one would stand for, which one would be the canonical image, the consensus image, the image that could be disclosed. And that led to a really interesting debate or discussion debate over what would count as the single representative image that would go out into the world, but also would stand for what the result was. So one idea was to average the different images from 3 different methods on the best observation day, April 11th, 2017. And if you just average them in a kind of blind, no complexity way, you got this image. But what was this image? And was this valid? So this led to a big discussion. I'm just going to take an example of thousands of such discussions that went on for months about what should be the idealized image. So this is from a discussion at Nijmegen in November 2018. So there was a session which I filmed. I used a very small part of it in Edge of All We Know, but this is from a part that's not included. So just as an example. So Heino said, yeah, it was good to have a clean image using that form of image making. You would have a sort of whatever, a smart imaging and a maximum, like a maximum entropy method, whatever, I don't know. You think that showing 3 different ones, that is to say 3 different methods, you would have a happy imaging team, because there's also a social aspect to it, because then maybe people recognize that the question is which should you use, but maybe together it would work. And so Michael Johnson then said, there is a social aspect, but I think that more importantly, showing each of these is profoundly important scientifically, right? None of us have strong feelings about the superiority of one over the other in the key image features. So Katie then said, but it's also for the different communities, because the different communities have different degrees of faith in the different image reproduction techniques. And then someone else said, the real problem is the fact that scientifically we can't tell one of these images produced with one method from another. If we had some way of saying one is better than 2, then we would put just 1. I think having multiple images produced with different methods reflects our uncertainty. It's valuable. It adds value. So Heino said, yes, it does. It's a human choice which data set to use, which method to use. And that sounds like something you have to reflect in some way. I said, there are 2 kinds of variability. There's variability of method, and there's variability of the results that you get by parameter settings, or how you employ the method. And the idea is to be upfront about these 2 kinds of variability, Jeff Bauer said. This is intended to be representative, that is to say, the image that would come out of this, right? Because, it's one day, right? April 11th. We're not presenting all 4 days of data here. I know we want it to fall within somewhere near the median of the possibilities that reflect both the systematic issues and the data. Heino said, okay, my gut feeling was that Silke at the time was arguing that the average image didn't correspond to anything in the data. It was a combination of data-driven, 3 different data-driven images. And she wanted us to stand behind data that correspond to a particular image. So there was that discussion too. So I'll just play for a minute or 2 of this so you can see sort of the tenor of it.
This is, yes, we do want to have a single image, but if
I checked the
possible,
computer
we
sound.
want to change to show the variation as well. We don't want to give the the appearance.
Okay, we'll skip
this.
this.
Is the one and
Okay.
only image, because if people come later.
So but these meetings, small meetings of focus groups of individual people pursuing individual methods, larger groups that collected the different image making methods, bigger groups yet that eventually led to the Nijmegen, where the whole collaboration was invited to participate. All of these were sequential ways of trying to achieve a consensus about what that image should be, what should be shown, what would stand for the result of the collaboration. One internal email said, of course, it's imperative that all statements in the paper are ones that we all feel that we firmly stand behind. If you have any concerns about how the results and conclusions are represented, please raise those as soon as possible. So there were Slack channels and these smaller meetings, bigger meetings, Zoom meetings, just a lot of meetings, because coming to the point where the collaboration actually would put their endorsement behind the particular methods and then the canonical or consensus image took months. I mean, Ramesh, you remember that. It was really a long process because having a view of the collaboration and not of different sectors of the collaboration was hard won and hard fought. Then there was a process of internal refereeing report. Once the paper was put together. It's a central paper for these first EHT publications, since it presents the images of the ring feature in M87. So this is probably maybe 3 months before the publication. It is due to convince the readers about the reliability of the results presented in the paper. In this sense, it uses different algorithms. It produces a global image for all the observing days, as well as individual images for each observing night. And there were specific recommendations by the internal refereeing reports and saying that more had to be done about how the different parts of the data are self-calibrated and different software packages. Why one particular sector of the data was preferred over the other, the low band over the high band, and what had been written up to that point. But the internal referee has access to the sort of core practices of the group in a way that an external referee doesn't. The disadvantage of an internal referee is that they've been part of these discussions. So in a sense, the two forms of refereeing, internal and external, represent different kinds of challenges to the emerging consensus and consensus image. An external referee report came in February, the next month. The paper represents landmark achievement. They're very supportive, but this was not at the sort of micro level of the internal refereeing report. And so there's some of the other issues that were raised by the external referee report, including how the training set was used to teach the machine learning program how to set its parameters in the best way that would then be used to look at the real data. And there's a set of responses. This went on for pages and pages. I'm just taking a tiny example from that. New appendices. One thing I wanted to point out here, the number of appendices, this is the external referee, says the number of appendices in the paper appear to indicate a substantial amount of internal refereeing by the EHT collaboration. And that was true. The appendices represented, in a sense, arguments, many of which were responding to criticisms from the internal refereeing. So by the time it went to the external referees, it had been very severely refereed, or not harsh, but rigorously refereed. And so that led to many changes, including a major expansion in the scope of the work. So then this is later February, Michael Johnson wrote, let's plan to go through the report carefully, correcting minor things when possible and identifying significant questions before the Thursday working group call, so we can discuss and converge as quickly as possible on a consensus response. So this was what a lot of the work was trying to figure out a way to address people's concerns, whether they were internal referees, external referees, or disagreements among the different focus groups or individuals. And then the publication working group had responses too. So to get consensus in the dispersed world of an experiment like the Event Horizon Telescope was complicated. And it was more complicated because an image was involved. An image was involved that required new forms of technical instrumentation, new forms of data correlation, all the way down to new forms of image reproduction or reconstruction. And there were these different forms of image making. We went through the stage of expert image analysis, of a mechanical or parametric analysis, and then all these arguments that went on for some time about what would stand for an image as the ideal or consensus or representative image that would go out to the world. The competing roles of simulations, of models and data was also crucial in getting consensus within the collaboration. Without these contrasts of model and simulations and models and data and simulations, there would be no consensus. And that kind of agonistic field continues in the present as new targets for the EHT are developed. So the layers of ever-evolving challenges of new people saying, well, what about this? Or could you test that? New proposed tests, refereeing, the new forms of refereeing of internal and external forms of revisions, of forums, of Slack, of meetings, from focus groups to working groups to collaboration-wide meetings, were all ways of trying to build up some sense of confidence in people with very different backgrounds and to have something that the collaboration could stand behind. That's why it took almost a year, nine or 10 months after the first images were produced before the collaboration agreed to publish it. Shep, then director, was keen to have a date against which we would be working. And he said, I don't know, maybe in the discussion, you can talk a little bit about how you estimated April 2019 as realizable from November. But that deadline then, like a pending execution, focused the mind, and I think accelerated the work enormously between November and April. So I want to come back to authorship and end. I began the first of these two lectures on authorship, looking at what I've called the pseudo-I, a group that functions under the name of a single author, like the Alvarez group or the Thorndike group. So even though those no longer functioned like individual work, they still maintained, in some sense, the useful fiction of it being the work of a single mind with help from others. But in fact, the work already by the 1960s had begun to disperse in important ways, but it still had a center. The bubble chamber was somewhere at Brookhaven, or it was at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. This site-centeredness continues, and even in the very large experiments like the Large Hadron Collider, you can have a group that functions without that single person name because they rotate spokesperson, but it still has it's still institutionalized. It's at CERN, and there's no question who's in charge of CERN. It's a person who gets paid a huge amount of money and is in a wood-paneled office and in a particular place. So even though there isn't a single lead institution among the participating universities, CERN still is a centerpiece. It requires regulation, governance, collective responsibility, allocation of credit, all problems that have been debated intensively over the last decade. And then there are these dispersed collective authors that are no longer site-specific. I would count LIGO in part that way because it began with 2 sites in Louisiana and Washington State, and then is extended to Italy and beyond. And the EHT, which is in some ways the most dispersed experiment in the history of large-scale science that I know of, because it has no headquarters, it has no central funding, it has no central authority in some sense. And so that's led to many discussions that try to achieve this consensus without being able to rely on a centered site source of funding authority or other means. The new forms of governance have been developed, the knowledge certification through an expanding set of challenges and tests to find consensus. All of this exacerbated because it's looking at something as complicated as an image, much more complicated than a single parameter result or a function of mirror displacement over time, in the sense that you can have two groups that have the same size ring but disagree about whether they're knots or where exactly the brightness of the crescent lies, whether there's external structure to this that we're seeing or not. There were a million different debates over the higher order of infinity that you have in an image over a single valued function. So these sorts of challenges extend to lots of aspects of the consensus that I haven't discussed here, but remain a challenge, like how are author lists going to be established? Who's a member? How is information restricted or distributed? How does the collaboration work with other external individuals, groups, institutions, or other collaborations? All of these questions in some ways issue from the dispersed nature of this new form of science. Thank you.
Peter, just a note, Tiffany says that your sound is coming through on the Zoom. So it might just be that your computer sound needs to be turned up, which might be,
Okay.
which something might come up if people have comments in the Zoom.
Peter, we cannot hear.
Have I misinterpreted, or were there two contradictory directives, one to mute and one to not mute?
Oh, sorry, I meant to turn the sound up. But you're fine. If people can hear you and
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I
Yeah.
don't have any control over the level of sound.
oh, just on your computer on it. But if we can hear it, so it should be fine.
Okay, sorry, but my speaker with the little crescents is grayed out. So I don't think I control my microphone level, if that's the question. So back to you. Can you hear me? Priya, can you hear me?
Yeah, but Peter, could you repeat the question? We all missed that.
The question from Ramesh was that the talk reminded him of a successful, challenging time, and one that was exciting, and he's happy with the results of the EHT, but he wonders in retrospect if I thought there were things that could have been done better, or conversely, looking forward, are there things that could have been organized otherwise? So I started to say that we had no real rules of the road about how disagreements were going to be handled. And so many times those ad hoc, everything from small Zoom calls to Tiger teams to, we tried sort of everything at some stage. But there wasn't much structure because, and I don't blame anyone for that. I don't think anyone had ever tried to do something like this before. Not just imaging a black hole, but a form of science that was organized, conducted almost entirely by Zoom, with institutions with no central funding, with no clear line of exactly who had what authority. We had institutions that had people running them in small groups or individuals. We had a director, Shep, we had a board, we had a scientific, that sort of director of science, Demetrios. We had these working groups and focus groups, but there wasn't a clear line of authority. And so sometimes when there were disagreements, I think they took longer to work out because we didn't have any kind of a roadmap. But what do you think? And I'd be interested in what Shep. I think LIGO was, not that they didn't have their disagreements, which they did, but they had, I mean, they were centered at 2 sites. They had central funding from the National Science Foundation, about $1 billion. And they had, they had I think a clearer sense, which, we had many countries over all the inhabited continents, and many institutions, and people were volunteering. So nobody had, it was essentially a volunteer effort with I don't know, Shep, 30 or 40 or $50 million for the period, somewhere in that range, depending on how you count, compared to $1 billion or $1 to $2 billion.
Right. But I mean,
Orders of
LIGO
magnitude.
also had decades, right? LIGO had decades to hone their playbook of how they were going to do things. You guys were also very scrunched in time.
Yeah, and I think LIGO also had a more well-defined problem than we did. I can make a couple of comments on
Yeah,
this,
please.
if it's appropriate.
Yes.
So I was going to say, you called it agonistic robustness. And how do you make sure that your results are robust? I tend to call it a creative tension when I speak about it.
Mhm.
And I think that an integral part of everything here was that we had multiple paths for everything. We had multiple calibration pipelines. We had multiple imaging pipelines. We had multiple modeling pipelines. So
Right.
everything was always in this state of tension, but it was a creative tension because different people had different ways of coming at this. And one of the nice things about the project is, and we built this in from the outset, that everybody saw their results reflected in the papers. So the reason for all those appendices that you point out in your talk was precisely because everyone got their appendix. So everyone knew it. Sometimes people's appendix are removed, but you were like adding more appendices.
No appendectomy.
Yeah, it's really it's like a reverse appendectomy. It's like an appendinsertotomy, or whatever. But that was really important to create a community feeling of inclusion.
Yes.
And without diluting the science, right? So you could have more people contributing without diluting things because there were all these appendices, right? So it made it important from that perspective. And I think building that in from the outset was really important. And then the other thing I would point out is that we'd never done this before. Nobody had ever tried to image a black hole before. So it really was a voyage of discovery in a certain way. And I would go even further. I mean, I've been doing VLBI for decades. And you can go to the literature and you can look at all these VLBI maps. And up until this result, people had looked at those maps and they thought, oh, that's a map. I believe that. And now that we have gone through in such detail, what goes into the realization and visualization of these interferometric data, you could go back to almost any of those VLBI papers and say, what a load of crap. I mean, those guys don't know, their antenna from a hole in the ground. But we would say, like, wow, they really have not proven which features are really real at this level. But we did. We went through the various different pipelines. And ultimately, we came up with a measure of variability that compared the different ways of knowing what we were looking at. And I think that was hugely robust. I think it was very upfront. It was very realistic and very open.
Yeah, I think that last point is just crucial, that there, in a bubble chamber picture, you get a bubble chamber picture. And everyone agrees ultimately you want to combine different angles to get a 3-dimensional reconstruction, but a bubble chamber picture was on 70mm film, was what it was. But I think for this experiment, the variability and acknowledging the variability of the image reconstructions was essential. And I think it's partly why there was this intensive discussion about the consensus image, because people thought we do need a consensus image. We do need, it really wouldn't work well to have every newspaper in the world publishing a different image that clashed with no explanatory structure about why they differed. On the other hand, making a single image out of what we all thought was a set of variations across the different methods and parameter settings, what created some tension. I mean, it precipitated a lot of very intense discussion. I gave you like 10 minutes discussion of that, but it was months talking about that.
I have a comment on that, Peter.
Yes, please.
So this creative tension the chef is talking about, of course, it's very important to get the quality up, but there are so many places where it can just derail the whole process. Two people don't agree, and then they dig in and nothing moves. You can lose months, years. What happened here was Chef put a deadline.
Right.
That was brilliant. I think that was a brilliant stroke. A few months before this deadline, everybody knew, look, however much we may fight, we need to have this product out by April, whatever. I think that.
I agree.
Yeah, apart from concentrating the mind, it really, people who are fighting had to figure it out.
Yes.
And yeah.
How did you pick I just want to ask Chap one question. How did you pick April 10th in November?
That resonates. This was the thing to do. And what we did was we came together and I got, project scientists, the chair of the science council together, and we sat down and I put the date far enough away so that nobody was threatened by it, right? Because I said, look, what if we do it here? And it was like,
Can you hear it?
No, we can't do it here. But then you put it far enough away that everyone's like, oh, well, of course we can do it by then. And I'm thinking, aha, like, no, there's going to be a lot of problems. But I had I would always show this email to everyone. Say, you said that we were going to do this, right? And then we got the NSF to put a stake in the ground saying we will be at the National Press Club at this time. And once the NSF says that, it's like, so you're exactly right. We help people speak to the fire. It focused the mind. And,
When I ask Sharon,
You might not make it.
no. No.
Everybody else
It might have when you're asked for a letter of recommendation.
So there was no alternative, there was no problem.
let me ask Sharon, and then Eric, and then Julius, and then Jamie.
Oh, I was just trying to get your attention to that.
Okay.
Hey Peter, thanks for a wonderful talk. So the story reminded me a lot of the work of Anton Pannekoek, who in the 1910s was interested in depicting the Milky Way, right? And what he ended up doing is asking a number of people, because he didn't trust photography, he asked a number of people to make drawings of the Milky Way, particular spots on the Milky Way, and then he would compare those drawings and he would quantify them, and then he would construct what he would call the mean subjective image. So that was, a collective effort of making a particular image of aspects of the Milky Way. Now, he was also a Marxist philosopher. Now, in his case, he wanted to translate that Marxist philosophy. He wanted to engage that Marxist philosophy in sort of motivating his work. However, it didn't end up with discussions of the collective, but rather with, engaging theories of mind and how that relates to work by the hand and how that relates to, making knowledge and what observation is.
So I don't know if you all could hear that. Sharon was saying, you were talking about Camerlingionus, right?
No, Anton Pannekoek.
Oh, about a set of experiments in 1910 where these questions of how to combine different parts of the data led to reflections on the theory of mind rather than the theory of the collective. Is that the gist of the?
Well, so these were images of the Milky Way, and they were drawn by hand. And what one then ended up doing was constructing an average image or a mean image, and he would call it the mean subjective image. And that would translate into reflecting about, how the mind steers these images and how the mind then, makes an image possible. Now, my question really is, were these sort of very explicit epistemological considerations also part of the EHT discussion, where people would, ask them each other also and themselves, what is observation and what does it mean to make a collective image?
Yeah, yes, I would say people, we certainly in the image group, we talked a lot about what are the potential sources of error and how we might be fooling ourselves and what we might do to counter that. Looking at parameters, not just expert judgment. I'm going to jump to the next question because I promised to end by 11. Thank you, Jerome, and we can continue that discussion. Eric.
So, Peter, you have now discussed at least, I think, 3 different ways, 3 different kinds of collaborative effort. I'm wondering if you can say anything about what, in your eyes, are the epistemological virtues and demerits of each. Whether some are manifestly in themselves better, or whether it's a matter of implementation. They all have good things. They all have bad things. What can we say anything more general about the epistemic character of all?
So I think epistemology is always about countering a fear. It's a response to a worry. We know, how could we go wrong? And at different times and in different kinds of science, that worry has different forms. For Goethe, the worry was that you would get fascinated by individual variation, and you needed to develop a set of methods to find and abstract the form that lay behind the particular plant that's moth-eaten and stepped on outside of your building. I think so I don't think that there is a universal epistemology. I think there's an epistemology is always an answer to a concern. If you're, worried that individuals might try to just confirm their own pet theory, then you get different competing groups to work in this agonistic way. If you're worried that all of them might share a predilection for a ring, then you try to make a computer-driven machine learning algorithmic approach that would do a parameter search over millions of possibilities and have some metric that's not dependent on your desire to see a ring. So I think that there are particular aspects of the epistemology of image making that are different, say, from the kind of problems that LIGO faced, where they're not making an image, or they may make images based on some of their results, but that's not the main goal at all. It was otherwise. And so LIGO has other concerns and therefore other forms of worries, like, do their template models, what role do they play? And are they diverse enough to capture the different possibilities? That's a related but different problem than the ones that were involved here. So yes, I think that, in a way, Ramesh's question and yours come together in this aspect. I think that this very capacious idea of bringing in all of these different tests and challenges and variants and were crucial in getting a consensus in the collaboration and getting an agreement outside of it. Julius and then Netta.
It's a bit of a longer question, but basically what I'm interested in is how intentional this whole process of arriving at the consensus is, and whether kind of looking at the roads sort of not taken can tell us something about how intentional versus how contingent it is. So for instance, there's the chirp algorithm developed specifically for VHT that ends up not being used, although the collaboration writes to instances of the RML which seem to be basically 2 independent teams doing one and the same thing. Why do you know why did that, or could you say something about why did that happen, or also like what whether, for instance, this
I think it's intentional but locally so. That is to say, at each stage there were a new set of intentions and aims that might not have been anticipated before it. It looked like chirp, which is basically an image technique that Katie Bouman developed and then was further developed by others too. Basically started with the idea that images that objects, or images of objects have a lot in common. There are actually not that many different things that pictures of actual objects do compared to random pixel noise. And that you could use the fact that there was like edges, or there were things that were common that could be used to restrict and advance the reconstruction technique. If you knew you were looking at an object at all, you could use that. I think that partly the decision, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what others think, Ramesh or Shep, but my memory is that Clean clearly we wanted to use Clean because that was a program that people had faith in. It was long-standing. It had been applied in optical and radio astronomy. It had many different groups. It had a kind of venerable status, even though there were known problems with Clean when you didn't have point sources. And then the RML methods had other advantages. And it just in that tussle over how to analyze this, we ended up not taking this brand new chirp method, but focusing rather on RML and Clean, basically. Does that correspond to your memory?
Yeah, it's along those lines. I mean, we did look at chirp, and there were papers published on chirp too. So it was absolutely investigated. But ultimately, we settled on about 3 different methods that were described in the paper.
Okay, I promised everybody that I would end on time as a model. I want to thank you all for your comments and for joining, and see you next time.